Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Hawes. I'm an occupational therapist, and I'll be presenting this presentation is on stimming and how it expresses empathy. That's not to be masked or persecuted. It's a scoping review and a case study of Milton's double empathy problem solved by recognizing the autism language. If you could save all your questions till the end, that would be great. Today, I'll be using identity first language. So autistic or autistic person. Person first language or person with autism has historically been practiced in the clinical literature. However, many autistic individuals and autism advocacy groups prefer identity first languages. Now, scholarly writers are beginning to follow suit. This presentation reflects the changes that society is beginning to make by endorsing identity first language, because autism is not a cancer or a disease. It's a part of a person's identity. So I'll be using autistic person or autistic and not person with autism. The following research questions guided my project. What are the current and historical perspectives of the autistic population throughout the lifespan? How have past assumptions about autistics and stimming influenced neurotypical society's perceptions of neurodiverse individuals today? How deeply have those perceptions been woven into interpersonal communications? Also, what is empathy? How do neurotypicals express and interpret empathy? What have autistic community leaders and researchers expressed about autistic empathy? And is stimming a component of the autistic empathy's dialogue? How does the neurotypical interpretation of an autistic stimming reflect on the health and well-being of the autistic? What types of interventions have been attempted with autistics to try to connect with them? And what has been the effect of those interventions on autistic mental health? And then, is there a better way to connect the neurotypical and the neurodiverse worlds in empathetic communication? So the first three questions lended themselves to a scoping review. And these were the themes that I identified: the prevalence of autism, the interpretation and measurement of empathy, the discovery of genetic factors actually transformed the autistic identity, and the publication of non-genetic factors such as vaccines undermined the legitimacy of the autism language. I found a problem with the lack of social language legitimacy. Another theme was autistic empathy, past and current interventions, that there are destructive interventions that thwart connection and cause mental health decline. A theme was the neurotypical perceptions of the autistic and the responsibilities required in dual communication. So one important revelation of this scoping review was that the maltreatment of autistics encouraged autistics themselves to dive deeply into autism research. So these autistic-led studies, now at the forefront of the neurodiversity movement, are growing in fervor. These studies show that there might exist an autism language, and it hasn't yet been defined or interpreted in a way that the neurotypical community can really comprehend. So moreover is this lack of understanding that neurotypicals have of the autistic that causes a disconnect between the two groups. My project included a scoping review, a retrospective case study, and 4 vignettes. Today I'll be talking with you about the retrospective case study. And also in my scoping review, I searched 12 databases, but only 5 of them produced any results. 3 of them had fewer than 10 articles. So this revealed a gigantic gap in the literature, especially a gap in autistic-led research and research that included the autistic perspective. I also read 5 raw primary sources. I attended a conference where Damian Milton, who is the author of the double empathy problem, was a keynote speaker. I discussed my work with colleagues, and my final work was reviewed by a national expert, Greg Santucci, who's an occupational therapist. Critical disability theory was one of the 3 frameworks that I used. That is that the neurotypical is in the social majority, so controls who's included and excluded in society. So neurotypical assumptions about the autistic in general and stimming in specific continue to influence the neurotypical's choices for inclusion. Also, I use critical autism studies. That's the interdisciplinary study of autism. It's derived from both critical disability theory and autism studies. But the criticality comes from investigating those power dynamics that operate in discourses around autism, questioning the deficit-based definitions of autism, and being willing to consider the ways in which biology and culture intersect to produce that disability. I also use critical disability and critical autism studies. Those are centered in the neurodiversity movement, with autistics now raising their voices and advocacy on all research platforms. And then finally, MOHO. So stimming and echolalia are neurophysiological functions that occur in all environments. So the positive or the negative perception that a neurotypical has of stimming and echolalia that affects the autistic person's environment. So such a change impacts the expectations that autistics have for themselves, their habits, their thoughts, their feelings about themselves, which will ultimately shape their social behavior. So there are questionable diagnostics of autism. An individual is characterized as autistic due solely to symptomology, specifically their stereotypical patterns of behavior or interests, by expert opinion and by consensus. Autism is heterogeneous, it's diverse. It lacks biological and construct validity, and research in it often finds contradictory abnormalities. So currently there are multiple subgroups of autism. Each one of them is vastly different than the other. So this has made it really hard for scientists to even talk about autism without questioning which autists they're referring to. Neurotypical empathy, let alone autistic empathy, still has not yet been clearly defined, and assessments of it actually lack construct validity. And then finally, debunked theories of autism remain common reasons behind many of the current treatments, even though these treatments have been proven to cause mental health decline. So here are some of those debunked theories of autism. Early in the mid-20th century, psychiatrists centered their frameworks on the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud. One of those was theory of mind, and that's inferring what another person is thinking or feeling. They said it's common to mankind, but absent in apes and autistics. Though theory of mind now is no longer used as a foundation in medical diagnosis, it is still actually being used as a foundation for certification for special education services, with school psychology assessments like the EPSI and the TOMI-2. So the belief that autistics lack social motivation has also been found to be inaccurate, but is still being used as a foundation to certify students for behavior services in schools. Many current theories are based on a deficit model of autism, except the double empathy problem, which was devised by Damien Milton. That is that the lack of understanding that autistics and non-autistics have for one another. So it's where the blame for misunderstanding rests equally on the shoulders of neurotypicals and autistics. Unfortunately, though, still, it is the autistics' responsibility to modify their behavior and increase their self-efficacy in order to accommodate the non-autistic people's perception of how a person should act. People are optimistic, though. However, because there is a paradigm shift in motion, but it's still being held back by approaches based on radical behaviorism and those other dated theories. So stimming is referred to by Webster Dictionary as a repetitive action or movement of the body. Echolalia is defined as the often pathological repetition of what's said by other people, as if echoing them. So it's hopping and flapping and fidgeting and making noises that range from squealing to digga digga digga. Neurotypicals, though, stim too. They click pens, tap feet, chew on gum, smoke, even do similar stims like autistics, like humming and fidgeting and flapping and hopping. Neurotypicals, though, assume that stimming is unnatural. Sasson called it a thin slice judgment. Eddie said that it prompts neurotypical mind blindness and unfavorable feelings about the autistic. Perception that stimming is abnormal is demeaning, and it's inaccurate. And really, if it continues to be prompted or promoted, autistics are not going to gain any social acceptance or opportunities for participation. A quote from Al-Qardi that I love is, if being perceived unfavorably is a barrier to inclusion in the social world, where autistic people who are in the population minority instead are condemned to isolation. So it causes depression. The more outside the norm the autistic considers themselves, the more depressed they often are. It indicates that the neurotypical perceptions of the autistic actually influences the autistic self-esteem. De Thorne said that it's the language barrier between the autistic and the non-autistic, rather than a disability of the autistic, that keeps neurotypicals and autistics from understanding one another and communicating empathy. Milton said it's widely known in society that to speak and understand a new language, a person needs the aid of an interpreter who is fluent in both their language and the one that they seek. So the autistic community is really making enormous efforts to incorporate that neurotypical language in their expressions and interpret the autistic language for their neurotypical audience, because they want to give credence to the autistic's full inclusion within it. But neurotypicals continue to misunderstand because they try to fit the autistic language within those little confines of the neurotypical framework of communication, but it doesn't fit. Their misunderstanding of the autistic causes neurotypicals to perceive that autistics are incapable of communication and empathy, thereby further diminishing the autistic's role in society. So research shows that stimming and echolalia are not rooted in pathology, but are components of environmental coping, social participation, and communication. They're important to the autistic identity. And so autistic communication might diverge from the typical, but the intention for connection is the same. But they're becoming victims of epistemic injustices because people who identify as neurotypical will therapize autistics into forgetting their native autistic language and cause post-traumatic stress disorders in the process. So this only further divides the autistics from neurotypicals, but there is a solution. When a person who identifies as neurotypicals engage with an autistic in that autistic story, while partnering in the rhythmical movement, it is received the same as when a neurotypical gives another neurotypical the warm eye contact, a smile, a friendly handshake. And that connection sparks because the rules of politeness were followed. So as a result of trying to fit autistics within neurotypical niches, autistics got forced to participate in various interventions designed to eradicate their mannerisms and their identity. And so in World War II, they were forced into eugenics by the Nazis. They had forced sterilization. They were considered non-persons. They weren't even recognized as a person. Attachment theory is one of the current interventions. And although that underscores the importance of parenting style as in a child's empathic development, early attachment psychologists deemed that all autistics were disorganized in attachment style. Therapies were derived from these theories, but instead of helping the relationship, they were a detriment. And they caused the autistic to experience mental health decline. Recent research, though, indicates that autistic attachment is intact, with one half forming secure attachments with caregivers. Another current intervention is ABA, or applied behavior analysis. An ABA provider's mission is to increase behaviors that are helpful and decrease behaviors that are harmful or affect learning via operant conditioning and classical conditioning. and they call that ABA services. So stimming and echolalia are often those targets of ABA services. The literature, though, shows that this service, it blocks the autistic from achieving occupational engagement and self-actualization. It causes PTSD to the same degree relative to the number of years they had ABA. And autistics are now coming forward about the abusive nature of ABA, and they're coming forward in droves. ABA teaches autistics to camouflage their autism, and especially not to stim. And camouflaging is also destructive. Autistics feel fake. They lose their identity. They feel loss of identity. And although the fact that autistics do attempt to camouflage their autism, despite those mental health challenges it creates for them, indicates intact or even maybe heightened social motivation. Here are some additional interventions, but this is not an exhaustive list of other interventions that autistic participate in. Learning environments, though, they need to manifest from the autistic voice, building on strengths rather than deficits. And moreover, the focus of treatment needs to be on training the neurotypical to communicate with the autistic and facilitating understanding of stimming. I'd like to talk with you about Adalia. She was my case study. She attended a non-public school and I was on her triennial assessment team. This was my first time ever meeting her since her services were being provided by the NPS rather than her local school district. So I made an appointment with her principal to conduct her OT assessment. When I arrived there, the staff told me that I should come back, that she was having a really bad day. I told them that if they would allow it, I'd like to see what a very bad day looks like for her. So the principal asked her TA to bring her to the principal's office, and that was in a corner of the building. The office had a desk and 2 couches with a coffee table between them. So I turned down the lights before she arrived to prepare her nervous system. As I was waiting, I could hear Adalia's really anxious vocalizations as they walked down the hallway toward me. I met him outside. Adalia, she hopped side to side, she flapped her wrists, she clicked her tongue. The expression on her face looked really distressed. Her eyes were wide, her brow was furrowed, and her lips were really tight. Her TA guided her toward the open door, and she kept rocking and fidgeting, and her vocalizations got even louder. So I stood with my body sideways to her, and I kind of reached out my hand about a foot or so to my side. I intentionally avoided eye contact. And I left my hand there, and I could feel after a couple of seconds some sweaty fingers in my hand as I said, as I introduced myself. According to her TA, she did look at me at that point. As she came in the door, her stimming did get more intense. Her TA did go to sit also. I asked her not to stay. I wanted to have control over all of the sensory stim that was in that environment. So I sat on one side of the table and Adalia sat on the other side. We were each on separate couches. And as Adalia rocked, so did I rock. As she clicked, so did I click. Our clicking at first was not synchronous, but as the seconds went on, it became quite in sync. She ended up, after a little while, I felt confident to look at her, and she was looking at me too, direct eye contact. She grabbed my head in her hands on both sides, and she gently pulled me toward her, and she bent her chin down, and she touched her forehead to my forehead. And as she sat back, she like looked into my eyes. She had this really soft smile, and she didn't use any words, but her hello was really resounding. After though, I co-regulated with her, and we said these hellos. I presented her with a Brunick's Ostrowski too, and I asked her to pick one. She chose one subtest after another, and until she completed the whole thing. I did use those supplemental instructions with the accompanying pictures in the back to support her understanding. But what's so incredible about this is that all of her previous IEPs said that she was untestable. And she did the whole Brunix. When I shared my assessment report at her IEP meeting, I told her mom about this, and she instantly teared up. She smiled. She reached across the corner of the table and gave me this gigantic hug. And she told me she only touches foreheads to family members, and she only just met you once. So Adalia proved to me that stemming is part of the autistic empathy dialogue, and that if stemming and echolalia are normalized through that neurodiversity movement in language discovery, that autistics and neurotypicals could finally come together for engagement in those self-actualized occupations. But there's dual responsibility in this communication. That will create a mutual understanding that is bound in co-empathy. But my connection with Adalia was not just a beautiful accident. So even after I ended services with her, I continued incorporating autistic social rules into all of my interactions with autistics. So regardless of their age, I almost always received a really clear, empathetic response and an attempt to follow through with the directions that I proposed in my OT sessions. Autistic social rules, though, engaged not only students, but the whole community. The community use of autistic language was exemplified in my vignettes. And so if you'd like to hear about those, I'll have another talk on them in the coming months. This project critically examined autism and autistic stemming through the lens of both the neurotypical and the autistic. It elevated the confines currently imposed upon autistics by neurotypical society. It synthesized what autistic leaders have expressed about their experiences, striving for inclusion so that co-empathy can be experienced. It authenticated that autistic empathy is physically manifested by the language of stemming. And it demonstrated that the stemming language can be taught to non-stemmers because it has form, it has structure, and it has predictability. So stemming is the autistic language. To extinguish stemming is to extinguish the autistic. Should that occur, hope for legal personhood and agency could disappear with it. But co-empathy can be experienced. Autistics have been ostracized by the assumptions that neurotypicals have made of them. This oppression has called a cyclic action and reaction dyad between the autistic and the neurotypical really for decades. And that has caused the double empathy problem. The autistic behaviors that the neurotypical community oppresses are similar behaviors that neurotypicals exhibit themselves, just less frequently or intensely. And that's caused many autistics to feel unfairly criticized. For this problem, it can be solved, however, with community participation and support. The first step, though, is for autistics to celebrate, be visible, be heard, be unapologetically autistic. Like with the cultural and the gender diversity movement in television, when other autistics watch and listen to autistics like Mel Baggs, and I'll show you her, they feel empowered to be themselves without judgment, without limitations. Identity develops when one is exposed to other people with similar characteristics. Identity also develops when autistics are at the forefront of autism research and the autism industry, like with co-production of equipment and of ideas and of research. There were some limitations to my project. There are vast gaps in autistic-led research and literature inclusive of the autistic perspective. Those permeate our databases. Though these gaps limited my scoping and review, the autistic voice was so cohesive, and that allowed a strong, really strong conclusions to be drawn. The case study participant provided permissions to utilize the papered assessments in this study, but declined further interventions. This might have limited the breadth of the case study, but it did not limit the depth because the papered assessments were rigorous and thorough. If the neurodiversity movement continues to permeate the neurotypical culture, the autistic language might eventually be taught in public schools by YouTube and other computer applications like German, Spanish, and American Sign Language are currently. Then autistics, occupational therapists, and speech language pathologists will be needed to take on leadership roles in the design, distribution, and instruction of the curriculum so that sensory processing and integration components of stimming and echolalic prosody are accurately described and interpreted. This re-educating of neurotypicals about autistic social language would diversify the neurotypicals' understanding of social behavior. Autistics could finally be free from ostracism, but future research would test the curriculum's fidelity. The implications for occupational therapists: we are self-reflective. We continue to be inundated with debunked theories of autism and the interventions that are associated with them. We should reflect on and eliminate these negative assumptions about autistics. We should replace those debunked ideas with those reflected in autistic-led research, because autistic people know autism better than anyone else. We're client-centered. If a child does not feel safe, or if they do not trust the people in their environment, they will not be able to get regulated. And if they're not regulated, they can't participate or learn. When encountering a dysregulated child, OTs often jump right into errors sensory integration pyramid. But to make a difference in regulation, we need to first assure that they feel safe, and feeling understood and honored influences safety. Perceiving the linguistic intent within stimming and compulsion will allow neurotypicals to recognize an autistic's inner emotional state and respond with empathy instead of ostracism or oppression. We should engage in autistic empathy. So whole body autistic listening is mirroring the autistic's body language back to them. Just like when two neurotypicals interact, you know how one shows empathy when they match the other's body language. If one person is really sad, it would be really rude for the other person to have to be really raucous and excited. It's the same with autistics. So I'm somehow capable of being in tune with both the autistic and the neurotypical worlds. I can speak and understand neurotypical, and I can somehow speak and understand autism. I've been incorporating this into my OT practice for years, but I didn't realize it was a solution to the systematic problem until I started this research. It really is the solution to Milton's double empathy problem. With co-production, autistics and neurotypicals work together as equal researchers, writers, and participants. So I'd like to show you Mel Baggs. Mel Baggs was a non-speaking autistic writer and advocate at the forefront of the neurodiversity movement until their premature death in 2020. Baggs's video, In My Language, remains one of the most transformative pieces on neurodiversity in existence today. It realizes the autistic experience as greater than what neurotypicals generally are able to perceive. Baggs recorded and then translated their stimming into this neurotypical verbiage, or into neurotypical verbiage. I'll get to this one. So this will be about 8 minutes.
The previous part of this video was in my native language. Many people have assumed that when I talked about this being my language, that means that each part of the video must have a particular symbolic message within it, designed for the human mind to interpret. But my language is not about designing words or even visual symbols for people to interpret. It is about being in a constant conversation with every aspect of my environment, connecting physically to all parts of my surroundings. In this part of the video, the water doesn't symbolize anything. I am just interacting with the water as the water interacts with me. Apart from being purposeless, the way that I move is an ongoing response to what is around me. Ironically, the way that I move when responding to everything around me is described as being in a world of my own, whereas if I interact with a much more limited set of responses and only react to a much more limited part of my surroundings, people claim that I am opening up to true interaction with the world. They judge my existence, awareness, and personhood on which of a tiny and limited part of the world I appear to be reacting to. The way I naturally think and respond to things looks and feels so different from standard concepts or even visualization that some people do not consider it thought at all, but it is a way of thinking in its own right. However, the thinking of people like me is only taken seriously if we learn your language, no matter how we previously thought or interacted. As you heard, I can sing along to what is around me. It is only when I type something in your language that you refer to me as having communication. I smell things. I listen to things. I feel things. I taste things. I look at things. It is not enough to look and listen and taste and smell and feel. I have to do those to the right things, such as look at books and fail to do them to the wrong things. Or else people doubt that I am a thinking being. And since their definition of thought defines their definition of personhood so ridiculously much, they doubt that I am a real person as well. I would like to honestly know how many people, if you met me on the street, would believe I wrote this. I find it very interesting, by the way, that failure to learn your language is seen as a deficit, but failure to learn my language is seen as so natural that people like me are officially described as mysterious and puzzling, rather than anyone admitting that it is themselves who are confused, not autistic people or other cognitively disabled people who are inherently confusing. We are even viewed as non-communicative if we don't speak the standard language, but other people are not considered non-communicative if they are so oblivious to our own languages as to believe they don't exist. In the end, I want you to know that this has not been intended as a voyeuristic freak show where you get to look at the bizarre workings of the autistic mind. It is meant as a strong statement on the existence and value of many different kinds of thinking and interaction in a world where how close you can appear to a specific one of them determines whether you are seen as a real person, or an adult, or an intelligent person. And in a world in which those determine whether you have any rights, there are people being tortured, people dying, because they are considered non-persons, because their kind of thought is so unusual as to not be considered thought at all. Only when the many shapes of personhood are recognized will justice and human rights be possible.
So stimming is the autistic language. To extinguish stimming is to extinguish the autistic. Should that occur, hope for legal personhood and agency could disappear with it. Here are my references, just for this slideshow. Do you all have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to talk about? I'd like to open it up to discussion.
Catherine, you mentioned that like before even turning to regulation strategies, being sure that the student feels safe. What are some ways that you suggest, like being sure that you're making the student feel safe?
So that piece came from Greg Santucci. So if you want to Google some of his strategies too, but some things that he talked about was a big piece is that initial rapport that you have with that person, of developing that rapport, taking time to develop that rapport, making sure that the environment meets their sensory needs, that it is not too overloading, not too understimulating. But the first part is developing that relationship.
Okay.
Sure. I'll go ahead and stop the recording here and